How can I know if I have ADHD? And that's a common question. ADHD is in the news a lot. People talk about it. We hear a lot about it. And it means attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But it is kind of a misnomer. Number one, because not everyone that has ADHD is hyperactive. In fact, for many, if they had it, it dissipates as we get older. Number two, for many people with ADHD, there is not a deficit in attention. Instead, it's that hyperfocused attention or distracted attention. You know, you're attending to too many things that causes us trouble. Now, there are three main types of ADHD. The first type is inattentive, which people used to call ADD. Second type is hyperactivity, and the third type, which is what I have, and it's the most common, a combination of both. Now, how does this apply to real life? Well, you know, it can manifest itself in a lot of things. You know, you can miss appointments, you're late for things, you're losing things all the time, you're talking to someone, you interrupt. Maybe people are talking to you and all of a sudden you're way off in left field and you're not paying attention. How about a floordrobe instead of a wardrobe? How about chronically biting your teeth all the time? I mean, it just can go on and on. So how do we know if we have it? Because there are things you can do. It doesn't mean that you're broken. It just means that, you know, you're different, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so what I have here is there's a test, and you can find it in the description, okay? So you can read it in the description below, but I'll go over it, and then you can look at it and see if maybe you need to pursue it more. So here's 18 questions that came up, you know, as a result of looking at the DMS-5 criteria. And 6 of the 18 questions were found really to be more predictive, and I'll go over that in a minute. And the others are more or less symptoms, but this is from the DMS-5 criteria, which is, you know, the Bible, if you will, for psychologists when they go ahead and they diagnose. So these are the criteria, and so the World Health Organization came up, they hired some people to come up with this screening device, and that's what I want to go over with you now. So, question number 1. How often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 2. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? Again, never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 3. How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 4. When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 5. How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 6. How often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things like you were driven by a motor? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 7, how often do you make careless mistakes when you have to work on a boring or difficult project? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 8, how often do you have difficulty keeping your attention when you are doing boring or repetitive work? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 9. How often do you have difficulty concentrating on what people say to you, even when they are speaking to you directly? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 10. How often do you misplace or have difficulty finding things at home or at work? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 11, how often are you distracted by activity or noise around you? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 12. How often do you leave your seat in meetings or other situations in which you are expected to remain seated? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 13. How often do you feel restless or fidgety? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 14. How often do you have difficulty unwinding and relaxing when you have time to yourself? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 15. How often do you find yourself talking too much when you're in a social situation? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 16. When you're in a conversation, how often do you find yourself finishing the sentences of the people you're talking to before they can finish them themselves? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. Number 17. How often do you have difficulty waiting your turn in situations when turn taking is required? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Number 18. How often do you interrupt others when they are busy? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. So those are the 18 questions. And the point is, if you look them over, and especially the first 6, and again, you can go down to the description, how are you looking at it? Were you rating yourself sometimes, often, or very often? If you had 4 out of the top 6 as a very often or often, and even a sometimes, then it may be that you have strong indications that you should go in and get an evaluation. Now, a lot of these surprised me when I was reading them because they're things that I've done. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a success, doesn't mean that you can't do all kinds of things with your life. It doesn't mean anything other than you have these issues. And here's the good news. Sometimes they recommend a stimulant, right? Pills, but a lot of this can be done, overcome with skills. And that's why we do this program, ADHD Hacks, and that's why we'll be doing more programs on ADHD where you can learn the skills, where we can go ahead and function the way that we need to be a success. So I hope that you can come back and listen to more. Go through these again, and if you find yourself checking off sometimes, often, very often, then it might be that you need to talk to someone and see if, if indeed you have ADHD, or at least have some executive functioning issues. And then you can find a coach. You can get some help. You can start listening to our videos and others on these subjects, where we can learn the skills that we need to continue to be successful in life. So again, I encourage you to go down in the description, look at the 18 questions and see how you rated, and then find out if you need to get more help. Thanks for joining me with ADHD Hacks. Please like and subscribe so you won't miss on any of our helpful videos. Also, for more books, videos, and information, you can go to ronovet.com.